The first house I ever lived in was a two-story home in Spring, Texas. My oldest sister had just moved out, so my other sister got her room, and I had our old one all to myself. She even got a bunk bed for when friends came over to stay. That first night was one of the rare times we got along as kids. I was on the bottom bunk, and she was on the top. I can't remember what we were talking about, as I was only around 5 or 6 years old. As we were chatting, I happened to glance at the closet directly across from us. There, in the doorway, I saw a figure. A shadowy man wearing what looked like a long coat and a hat. What struck me most were his eyes. They looked human but had red irises. Oddly enough, he didn't scare me. If anything, he felt oddly familiar, almost comforting. I kept looking at him and said, "Hey, there's a man in the closet." My sister, understandably alarmed, asked what I meant. So I repeated, "There's a man in the closet, and he has red eyes." I'm not sure if she saw him too, but I'll never forget the piercing scream she let out before jumping off the bed and running out of the room. That's when I realized that this might actually be something to worry about, so I ran after her. Eventually, our mom believed it was something evil and anointed the house with holy oil, praying over every corner. I think this is also why our pastor later visited and got rid of anything that might be considered unholy, like our copy of Beauty and the Beast because it involved magic. In the end, I developed a fear of closets and a lifelong fascination with the paranormal. My family has been experiencing strange things for a long time, and I'm not sure what to believe anymore. For context, over the past 3 years, my mother has told me every morning that she wakes up in the middle of the night to see strange figures in her room. Sometimes it's small creatures with pitch-black bodies, red eyes, and no mouths, or really tall figures with horns. She insists they're real and that she sees them while fully awake. I believe her because my mother is a serious person and deeply religious. I've been startled awake many times, terrified by my mother's sudden, intense screams. It's always unexpected and frightening. My grandfather, who lives in the basement apartment, has similar experiences. He's claimed to see writing in blood on his walls, an indigenous woman dancing beside his bed with a warning about his wife, and a girl who looks just like me but with blonde hair standing near him. I tried to dismiss these as hallucinations or sleep paralysis, but similar things have happened to my sister and me too. I once saw a man who resembled my great-grandfather watching me as I slept, and I felt a poke on my shoulder when I was alone in bed. My sister says she's seen people running in the halls at night and even claims to have levitated in her sleep, which I find hard to believe, but it's worth mentioning. Interestingly, 2 other family members haven't experienced anything like this, which I find strange. My mom had mediums visit the house, and they used sage to cleanse it. The medium said that a Victorian woman lives in my mother's room and that a little girl is always by her side. This struck me as odd since I had a sister who sadly didn't survive infancy. I'm really unsure what to make of all this. Sergeant John Harris tragically lost his life on April 15, 2011, after a deeply unsettling incident at St. Mary's General Hospital. He was found hanging from a 4th-floor window, and it took the emergency team 6 minutes to break through the door that had been jammed shut and cut him down. By the time they reached him, it was clear that the situation was dire. 6 minutes might not sound like much, but for someone struggling to breathe, it's an eternity. During that time, a crowd gathered in the parking lot and witnessed something even more unnerving. As John Harris's body hung from the window, a figure, possibly a nurse, appeared to be trying to pull him back into the room. Unfortunately, she only managed to grab the rope, unintentionally making the scene even more disturbing. To understand Southeast Asian beliefs about the supernatural, it's essential to recognize that locals see their countries differently than tourists do. While visitors often share images of beautiful beaches and charming street scenes, those who grew up there remember the oppressive heat, humidity, and old stories about supernatural entities that can follow you home if you're not careful. These ancient fears remain, even in modern cities. Writing this from my apartment in Los Angeles, far from those memories, gives me a sense of safety. Most of my stories come from my time in the military, Although I never had any supernatural encounters myself, I met many servicemen with their own eerie tales. One person who frequently shared these stories was a technical sergeant in our unit. I can't recall his name, but we spent many nights on guard duty at Tower Number 3, overlooking a moonlit airfield. One night, while we were on duty, he told me a story that I'll never forget. You know, John didn't take his own life, right? John was a small guy, about 130 pounds, and that often made him feel insecure. Maybe that's why he had a tough demeanor and wasn't the easiest person to get along with. His personal life was also troubled. John's girlfriend, Emily, had been with him since high school. She knew she deserved better but never found the courage to leave him. As her friends shared stories of romantic gestures and exciting relationships, Emily grew more and more resentful of her situation. Eventually, she became obsessed with the idea that John was unfaithful, and she was right. One evening, Emily came home to find John with another woman. The betrayal pushed her over the edge. The next day, she stormed into the military camp, causing a scene. Later that day, wearing a red dress, Emily tragically ended her life by jumping from their 8-story apartment window. She timed her fall to coincide with John's return from work, but by the time he arrived, the scene had already been cleared. In some cultures, the color red is associated with joy and vitality, but when someone passes while wearing red, it's believed to be a sign of a restless spirit seeking revenge. This terrified John, who, riddled with guilt, sought help from a spiritual advisor. The advisor warned him that Emily's spirit would roam the earth for 41 days. If John could survive that long, he would be safe. But how would he know she was coming? "You'll hear her," the advisor said. John left, haunted by those words. The next month was a blur of fear and paranoia for John. He was constantly on edge, flinching at every noise. He avoided the dark stain in the parking lot where Emily had fallen, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she would come back for him. One night, while working on a report at home, John heard a terrible crash in his living room, followed by a heavy thud. His mind raced as he remembered the advisor's words. Paralyzed by fear, John hid, squeezing his eyes shut as the sounds grew closer. Then, everything went quiet. No one knows how long John stayed there, too terrified to move. When he was finally found during a wellness check, he was a broken man, babbling about what he had seen. He was hospitalized for months and, tragically, he made multiple attempts to end his life before the final incident. The advisor had been right, but only in part. Whatever had found John that night didn't need to see him to take him. If Emily's spirit had been limited to the way the advisor suggested, John might have been safe. But there was one crucial detail. Emily had landed on her head. "Wait, you said John didn't take his own life?" I asked, feeling uneasy. The sergeant gave me a hard look. "You can't easily barricade doors in a hospital. He wouldn't have been the first to try. And the last few times I spoke to him, he didn't seem like someone who was planning to harm himself. He just really didn't want to be alone." I struggled to process what the sergeant was implying. "Are you saying something else was responsible? What about the nurse who tried to save him?" The sergeant took a long pause before answering. "The only person who saw that nurse up close was Dr. Lee from the next ward. He didn't recognize her, but he said she had the widest grin he'd ever seen." The sergeant added, "And she was wearing red." When I was younger, my grandmother often claimed that she could see ghosts. It always freaked my mom out, but as a child, I didn't think much of it until we moved into a new house. I know this might sound like the setup for a scary movie, but I promise it's true. At night, we would hear strange noises, like babies crying and the eerie sounds of old women laughing and screaming. It didn't really bother me until one day. While I was washing my hands, I saw something that changed everything. I looked up and saw a figure standing behind me in the mirror. Terrified, I ran out of the bathroom, but at the same time, I couldn't help but be intrigued. My grandmother had this strange ability to see these spirits just by looking in their direction, but I could only see them in mirrors. Every time I passed by a mirror, I'd see him, the figure. I don't think he was malicious because he never tried to harm me. In fact, I used to talk to him for hours. But things changed when we moved after my mom walked in and saw me talking to him. The figure ended up following my grandmother instead. I eventually moved in with my aunt and, for a while, I forgot about him. Years later, when my grandmother passed away, I attended her funeral and we shared stories about our childhood. Someone mentioned a ghost and all the memories came rushing back. Scared me and I developed a phobia of mirrors. I couldn't be alone for long periods without feeling like I was being watched. I think when she passed away, the figure started following me again, though I couldn't confirm it until one night. I was sitting in the living room on the couch, with my uncle on another couch and my brother standing nearby. I was focused on something on my phone when I suddenly felt a presence behind me. Then, something grabbed my shoulder. I jumped up in a panic and ran behind my uncle. They looked at me like I was imagining things, but I knew it was him, the figure. Now I'm 15, and it's been a couple of years since that happened, but I still feel his presence and the presence of other spirits around me. Sometimes, I even hear them whispering. I haven't seen them again, probably because I avoid looking into mirrors for too long. But I still can't be alone for more than 15 minutes without feeling like they're watching me, and my phobia of mirrors remains.
My friends and I are big fans of mountain biking. There's this one trail near our hometown that winds up a nearby mountain, and it was the first trail we ever rode together. It had been a couple of years since I last rode it, so I decided to revisit the trail to relive that first mountain biking memory. The mountain itself is pretty small, with a few houses scattered at the top. Occasionally, you can hear construction or lawnmowers echoing down the slopes. On this particular day, I heard what sounded like a lawnmower as I started hiking up the steep trail with my bike. But as I climbed higher, the sound seemed to get much closer, like it was right nearby, despite there being no houses for miles in that direction. I reached a steep clearing and was confused by what I saw. There was a small loop off the main trail that I vaguely remembered from before, but it was much narrower than I recalled. To my surprise, I saw a group of people riding ATVs on this tiny loop. It didn't make any sense. I got really freaked out, thinking I had accidentally wandered onto someone's private property. I quickly turned around and rode back down the trail. Later, I texted my friend about what I'd seen, and we started wondering if we had taken a different trail that first time we went mountain biking. Maybe I had stumbled upon an ATV trail by mistake. I checked Google Maps, and as I suspected, there wasn't a single house or road nearby that could explain what I saw. The next day, my friend and I decided to hike up the trail together to check out the spot where I saw those ATVs. What we found was even stranger. There was nothing there. Not a single sign that anyone had been there recently. The trail was too narrow for ATVs, and there wasn't even a clear path they could have taken to get there in the first place. As we looked around, we did find one piece of evidence that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. A short stretch of tracks about 10 feet long, made by large ATV wheels. But there were no signs of where an ATV could have entered or left the area. It didn't make any sense. The path we had taken up was challenging enough on foot, with mountain bike drops ranging from 1 to 4 feet high. There's no way an ATV could drive up such a steep slope. So, where did these riders come from? How did they get those heavy ATVs into that remote area? I still can't explain it. It's a mystery that makes no sense at all.
This happened about 25 years ago near Lake Northwood. I had a friend visiting me at my grandparents' place, and we decided to go fishing. We hopped on our bikes and rode down the road before turning towards an old house in a large field where my uncle was living at the time. My uncle often had friends over to play music together at his place. As we biked past his house, I noticed his car was gone, but one of his friend's cars was parked in the driveway. We continued down an old dirt road toward the river and found a good spot to fish. I had brought along a .22 rifle for protection against mountain lions. We had been fishing for about 30 minutes when my friend wandered over a log jam, and I lost sight of him. I called out his name, but he didn't respond, so I followed him over the logs to bring him back closer to me. When I reached him, I suggested he come back to the other side where I was. Just then, I noticed fresh cougar tracks in the mud. We decided to head back to the first spot we were fishing at, and that's when things got strange. As I stood by the river, I heard someone call my name. I paused and heard it again. The voice was familiar. It sounded like one of my uncles. So, my friend and I started walking downstream toward the area where the voice was coming from. As we got closer, I heard my name called out again, and this time, I answered back. But as soon as I did, we were met with the most unsettling sound. A loud chorus of crows, all cawing at once from the same spot where I had heard my name. My friend and I freaked out and sprinted back to our bikes. We pedaled as fast as we could out of the woods, and as we reached the field, the crows suddenly fell silent. Instead, we heard music coming from my uncle's house. It sounded like he was back home, playing with his friends. But when we reached the house, his car was still gone, even though the music was blaring. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. I thought maybe he couldn't hear me over the music. Just as I turned the door handle, the music abruptly stopped. We could still hear it fading out slowly as we walked in. We headed left, peering through the kitchen into the music room. The drums were still vibrating slightly, and the electric guitar sound was still fading. But when we got to the music room, it was empty. No one was there. I checked all the bedrooms, but there wasn't a soul in the house. Just then, I heard a car approaching the house and looked out the window. It was my uncle. Now I was really confused. As I walked back towards the kitchen to leave, I suddenly heard loud footsteps, like someone running up the stairs to the attic. That noise freaked me out instantly, and I grabbed my friend and bolted out the door. Outside, my uncle saw us and started laughing. I must have looked completely spooked as we rushed out of the house. The reason I freaked out at the sound of those footsteps is that the door leading to the attic in the kitchen was boarded up from the inside. There was no way anyone could have gone up those stairs without first removing the boards. As we stood outside, my uncle chuckled and asked what was wrong. Then he casually said, "Oh, that's just the ghost that lives here." I never went back to that house again. I still see it every day when I drive by, but I'll never set foot inside again.
This is an older story that my dad has shared with me a few times over the years, but with Halloween approaching, it's been on my mind again. I've never seen the house myself, but the way my dad and a few others described it, even 20 years later, gave me a vivid mental image. First off, it's worth mentioning that my father is a very religious man. His father was a preacher, and he doesn't believe in ghosts or anything paranormal. He's not easily scared either, but he still insists that something unnatural happened that night, something that truly shook him up, even when he just mentions the story. Back in the late 80s, he and some friends would often hike around the waterfall and creek bed behind our farm, following the trails until they met up with the frontage road near the interstate. One night, they decided to take a different route, going around the back of another farmer's land, mostly to see the animals since that farmer had some unique pets like emus that weren't common in our area. After leaving the area and continuing into the woods, at night, of all times, they stumbled upon what they all describe as a house straight out of a horror movie. It was a very old home, and my dad says that just looking at it gave him a deep sense of dread. But, of course, curiosity got the better of them, and they decided to check it out. Inside, the house looked like it was built in the late 40s or early 50s with a vintage cottage style. But the inside was far from charming. The walls were covered in strange symbols and writing in what seemed like an old, mysterious language, with some graffiti in English that referenced dark rituals or sacrifices to some kind of malevolent entity. My dad swears that some of the symbols were painted in blood, while others were clearly done with spray paint. Given that he had worked as a firefighter and had seen his share of accidents involving blood, he was certain of what he saw. Past a small living room and kitchen area, there was a narrow stairwell. The stairs went straight up, then turned at a small landing before continuing, so you couldn't see what was at the top until you were almost there. At the top of the stairs was a large attic-like room. Chains and manacles hung from one of the walls near a circular window, and the room was covered in more of those unsettling symbols and graffiti. There were large, dried stains on the floor and walls that looked like old blood. While they were exploring the room, they heard footsteps coming up the stairs behind them. Quick, sharp sounds, almost like someone wearing heels. But when they looked back, no one was there. The dust and grime on the floor didn't show any new footprints except their own. To keep things interesting, I later spoke to each of the men separately to see if their stories would match. I was half expecting to find some inconsistencies, but they all described the exact same details without hesitation. After leaving the house, they decided to try walking back from a different direction, using a compass to guide them. But no matter what direction they started from, north, east, or west, they always ended up right back at the front entrance of the house. It didn't make any sense. The compass and their knowledge of the area told them they should be somewhere else, but they kept returning to the same spot. They tried this at least 10 times, but every time they found themselves standing at the front door of the house. Eventually, they started to feel physically ill, with one of them nearly fainting. That's when they decided it was time to leave for good. But just as they turned to go, one of them looked up and pointed at the circular window on the second floor. There, they all saw a tall, shadowy figure, a woman, standing in the window watching them. Her features were hard to make out, but her eyes were large and dark. She seemed to shuffle slightly before turning and moving away, as if heading toward the stairs. At that point, they all ran as fast as they could through the woods, eventually ending up on the side of the interstate, about 3 miles from my dad's house where they had started. They made it back home, but they claimed they felt like something was following them the entire way. When they got back, my dad's cousin went to the kitchen for a drink of water, only to come back and say he thought he saw the same figure standing outside the window, near the edge of the woods. Thankfully, nothing more came of the experience, though they all remained deeply unsettled by it. 5 years later, they decided to go back and see if the house was still standing. When they got there, they found it had collapsed into a pile of rubble, and they never went back again. I used to joke with my dad about what he'd do if he went back and found the house standing just as it was before, hoping he might let me go and see the place for myself. But with today's trespassing laws, it would be nearly impossible to visit without getting into serious trouble, especially since it wasn't on our property. I don't know, it still gives me chills to think about it. I never fully believed the story until I talked to all of the guys involved. And when I say that these grown men were genuinely frightened by this experience, I mean it. Seeing how worked up they got just telling the story made me a lot less skeptical. What do you all think? Could it be that they were just spooked and started seeing things? Or is there more to it?
A while back, I landed a temporary gig with a tech company driving one of those vehicles equipped with a 360-degree camera system. It was a pretty cool job. My task was to record highways, streets, and sometimes off-the-beaten-path locations in remote areas. They provided a company car, covered my gas, hotel stays, and even gave me a per diem for food. The pay was decent too, around $7,000 a month before taxes, although I was a 1099 contractor, so there were no benefits. The car was my office, and I'd work 5 10-hour days each week. I didn't have much human interaction, which made the job lonely at times, but I enjoyed the adventure and the sightseeing. The work was straightforward, though it required a lot of multitasking. Navigating the roads while managing the computer and the camera system mounted on the roof. One assignment took me to a small town somewhere north of Marysville, California. It was a quiet place with a charming countryside feel. I was wrapping up my shift before the weekend and decided to take a shortcut down a dirt road that I thought would connect to the highway. I quickly regretted that decision. It was 5 p.m. in the middle of July, so the sun was still up. However, the dense foliage and overgrown trees along the path made it dark and eerie, almost like a scene out of a horror movie. I switched on my headlights for better visibility. As I navigated a sharp turn on a downhill slope, my headlights caught the reflection of a yellow dead-end sign. Luckily, there was enough room for me to make a U-turn safely. This section of the road was the darkest, with only a few small patches of sunlight filtering through the canopy of trees above. After repositioning my car to head back, I glanced in the rearview mirror and noticed someone standing near the dead-end sign. It looked like a kid, maybe around 13 years old. He had a bowl cut and was dressed in dark, worn-out clothes. His face was pale, and he had a distant, unblinking stare that was fixed in my direction. He showed no expression and didn't move. Concerned for his well-being, I decided to check if he was okay. I rolled down my window and reversed the car closer to where he was standing. Once I saw the brake lights reflecting off the yellow sign, I parked. I expected him to approach the driver's side window, but he didn't move. When I looked in the rearview mirror again, he was gone. I didn't hear any footsteps or the sound of twigs snapping. Nothing. It was as if he had vanished. The forest was unsettlingly quiet, the only sound being the hum of my car's engine. I slowly drove away, heading back up the hill. When I was about 100 yards from the main road, I saw what appeared to be the same kid walking about 50 yards ahead of me. It could have been someone else, but the dark shirt, ragged jeans, and his overall size matched what I had seen earlier. He had his back to me, and from that distance I couldn't make out his hair or facial features. He walked out of the forest and onto the main road, heading east. I waited until he was out of sight before exiting the forest and driving in the opposite direction. I was so spooked that I didn't even bother checking the rearview mirror. I just floored it and got out of there as fast as I could. The car's cameras worked using a LiDAR system, automatically capturing 360-degree panoramic images while in motion. Since the camera was recording during the encounter, I assumed the kid would have been captured in one of the photos. But when I reviewed the images from where I made the U-turn at the dead-end sign, there was nothing. No kid, no shadow, not even a hint of a person. The only thing in the photo was the yellow dead-end sign, the overgrown trees, and the dust kicked up by my car. I checked the recording from the second sighting when I exited the forest. Again, nothing. I had no evidence of anyone being there. I'm not sure if it was due to lack of sleep, dehydration, or just my eyes playing tricks on me, but I'm pretty convinced I saw something beyond the ordinary. During my school years, my mother and I often heard our names called in our own voices, and we'd hear the door opening and closing even when no one was home. Sometimes the heavy metal door was even locked, yet the sounds persisted. Although these occurrences were unsettling, they didn't strike me as particularly dangerous or spooky. That all changed when I started living in my college dorm. In our sophomore year, we learned about a girl who had lived in our dorm room about 5 to 10 years earlier. She had tragically taken her own life in the restroom. I had always found the ceiling in there oddly peculiar, so the explanation didn't completely shock me, but it definitely gave me the creeps. The story went that she tied a noose to the light fixture, climbed on the toilet, and hung herself. I couldn't understand why someone would go to such lengths. Unfortunately, it wasn't the first time I'd heard a similar story. Once we moved in, strange things began happening. Items would go missing for no reason, only to suddenly reappear in spots we'd already checked after someone would jokingly call out, "That was mine! I want it back." It was bizarre. One time, I returned to my dorm between classes and discovered someone had left the electric stove on. I was furious. That old stove could have caused a disaster if I hadn't noticed. I asked my roommates, but no one admitted to leaving it on. I brushed it off as people not wanting to take the blame, yet it left me feeling uneasy. That was just the beginning of the odd occurrences. The most shocking event happened one evening in the dorm kitchen. We shared a block of rooms, complete with our own bathroom, which is quite nice for a dorm. I was cooking when I realized I needed to charge my phone. I went to my room to grab my charger, and when I returned to the kitchen, I noticed my friend and roommate lying on her bed, looking furious for no apparent reason. I shrugged it off as we weren't on the best of terms at the time. As I was in the kitchen, I caught sight of my friend walking out of the restroom. Confused, I exclaimed, "What the heck? Are you a superhero? How did you get in there without me noticing?" She replied, "What are you talking about? I've been here the whole time, using the restroom. I thought you were in our room charging your phone." I insisted that I had been cooking for at least an hour. We both stood there, shocked, realizing we had seen each other in two different places at the same time. Neither of us could explain it, and we were both bewildered, feeling inexplicably angry with each other. Another friend had a strange experience of her own. She spent the night at a male friend's apartment and dreamed she woke up to prepare for class. Her friend was taking a long shower, and his phone kept ringing, so she answered it. The number was unknown. To her surprise, her own voice asked, "Is this male friend?" Confused, she replied no and asked who it was. Her voice responded again, "It's me, Nadia." When she woke up, she dismissed it as just a dream. Later, on her way to class, her phone rang. Thinking it was her friend, she answered, "Is that you, male friend?" To her shock, her own voice came through again, sounding puzzled. "No, it's not. Who is this?" She responded, "It's me, Nadia." Realizing it was the exact conversation from her dream, terrified, she threw her phone away and burst into tears. When she checked, there were no missed calls since the previous evening. The memory still gives me chills. Milder but still unsettling events occurred when I was alone in the dorm. Most of my roommates had gone home for the holidays, leaving me in an almost empty block. I noticed that every time I turned off the kitchen light and left the room, it would mysteriously turn back on. I didn't think much of it since the dorm was old. Once, I found myself locked out of my room after stepping out to use the restroom. Fortunately, I had left my keys in the lock, so I was able to get back in. But once inside, I discovered I was now locked in. I was the only person in the building, so I was perplexed. One night, I woke up to use the restroom, feeling groggy. I reached for the bathroom door, but it was locked from the inside. I found it strange since there were no locks on the outside. The light was on, which added to my unease. I decided to wait until morning, filled with dread since I was the only one in the dorm. Who could be in the restroom? When I finally checked, the light was still on, but the door was unlocked. There were other odd occurrences as well, like the sounds of footsteps in the kitchen and the faint sound of someone talking on the phone. I lived on the top floor with no neighbors above me, and my entire floor was deserted. Eventually, I chose to ignore the strange happenings, resigning myself to cohabiting with the ghostly presence. After I stopped paying attention, the strange events lessened, but she never stopped occupying the restroom. We also had friends among the guys in another dorm who claimed they had their own ghost. They told us about the girl who had taken her life in our room. They experienced similar phenomena: doors opening and closing, lights flickering, missing belongings, and strange noises. They even gave their ghost the name Boris. Our girl remained nameless. In our senior year, we decided to try a card game meant to contact the spirit of the place. You shuffle a stack of cards and ask yes or no questions. We had a new roommate that no one particularly liked. When we asked if the keeper of the dorm liked her, the answer was a resounding no. We then asked if they could do something to make her leave, and the answer was yes. I didn't think much of it at the time, but the girl ended up moving out within a month due to various troubles, leading to police being called to our dorm. I can't help but wonder if our game had something to do with it. It's been almost 3 years since I moved out, and I haven't experienced anything like that again. Sometimes, I find myself pondering whether it was really a ghost or just our imaginations running wild. Was the phone incident connected to the story of the suicide, or were they unrelated occurrences? Why did things go missing, only to appear after we asked about them? Were the keeper and the ghost the same entity? It was genuinely frightening, and I'm not sure I want to find answers to those questions. It all happened, and we eventually moved on. I'm 28 and my partner, who is 27, and I love going on ghost tours whenever we travel. Most cities offer them if you look around, and they're usually pretty cheesy. A guide takes you through the city, sharing its haunted history and trying to spook you. They encourage you to take pictures and sense the energy. It's all pretty generic and amusing. We enjoy it for a good laugh, and it's a fun way to spend time. We've done this in places like Boston, Salem, Savannah, Texas, New York, really all over the US, and it never gets old. Recently, we visited Key West, which has a rich haunted history and plenty of tours, so of course we signed up for one. The tour started off like most others, a young woman, probably in her 20s, leading us around in old-timey makeup, pointing out the popular spots. We visited Robert the doll's house, walked through a graveyard, and even stopped by a haunted bar. My partner and I were chuckling throughout. The last stop was a pirate museum, and by then we were already joking around. As soon as we entered, I felt a wave of nausea hit me. My stomach started to churn, but I brushed it off at first. The guide began her talk about some tragic deaths and strange occurrences tied to the place. She was mid-sentence when I felt a sharp headache coming on, and I grabbed my partner's arm because I thought I might get sick in front of the group. She noticed something was off and asked if I was okay, but I couldn't get the words out. Felt like I was choking and I couldn't breathe. I nodded to assure her I was fine because I didn't want to make a scene. As the guide led us to another room, I clung to my partner, feeling like my legs were about to give out. The floor seemed to tremble beneath me, and I was on the verge of vomiting. It was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. A deep, unsettling sickness that wouldn't go away. My ears started buzzing, and my eyes burned, and I was certain I was going to faint. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw what I can only describe as a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room. It was just watching us. There was no face, no eyes, no clear form, just a dark, shadowy presence. I opened my mouth to scream, but in an instant, the figure vanished. Just like that, it was gone. I bolted out of the museum and ran outside. I'm sure everyone thought I'd lost it. As soon as I got outside, I could breathe again, and the sick feeling vanished, but my body remained tense the entire way back. For a while afterward, I had vivid, unsettling dreams. They lingered even after we returned home. My partner teased me, saying I was just making it up, but I'll never forget what I saw. I'll never forget that overwhelming, sickening feeling. Key West is, without a doubt, the scariest place I've been in the US, and I stand by that. About 10 years ago, my friends and I used to explore an abandoned, winterized house in a remote area near Mason, New Hampshire. The place was pretty isolated, with no neighbors nearby and dirt roads leading up to it. It was an intriguing spot that had been abandoned since around 2005, based on the boxes and papers we found. Inside, we discovered some Latin writings, a pentagram in the sunroom, and snake paintings on the walls. The rest of the house seemed fairly normal, though it had clearly been rummaged through. The bedrooms and living room were a mess. One reason we liked going there was that it was private, and we could sift through the old belongings without being disturbed. However, there was always a heavy, negative feeling in the air, though nothing strange had ever happened, until one day. On that day, we ventured into the basement, where we found metal chains hanging from the ceiling, the kind you'd secure around your wrists with your hands above your head. There was a dark brown stain on the floor beneath them, along with a bunch of chemical bottles, strange glasses, and other odd items on a nearby workbench. Suddenly, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, and what I can only describe as a telepathic message urging me to get out. I told my friends I had a bad feeling and needed to step outside. I quickly ran up the stairs, crossed the threshold between the front door and the basement, and went outside. While I was walking around the front of the house, waiting for my friends, I got the eerie sensation that something was watching me. I looked around the wooded area and then glanced up at the house. To my shock, a white face was staring at me from an upper window. Startled, I panicked and ran into the woods. After about 30 seconds, I calmed down and returned to the house. When I looked back up at the window, the face was gone. My friends soon came outside and asked what was wrong. I told them what I saw, and though I didn't agree with their plan, they decided to break the window. I didn't want to cause any more trouble, so I let it happen. We stayed outside for another hour before deciding to leave, but when I tried to start my car, a 1997 Saturn SC2, it wouldn't start. There were no lights, no sound, nothing. The battery was completely dead, even though I knew I hadn't left any lights on or the key in the ignition. As it started to get dark, we sat by the car, trying to contact someone for a ride. One of my friends pointed to the top left window and asked if I could see anything. When I looked, I couldn't believe my eyes. There were two large, faint, but dark red eyes floating there, moving slightly as if whatever it was breathing heavily. I told him what I saw, and he admitted he thought he was losing his mind. We kept watching the house while the others tried to get a signal, but those eyes never moved from the window. About 30 minutes later, another friend arrived to pick us up. We pushed my car down the hill to a lake deeper into the woods, where there was no cell service. We moved it there so that if the police ever came by the house, I wouldn't get in trouble for trespassing, and so the tow truck could easily find my car. The next morning, I had my car towed to the shop for a new battery. When they called me with an update, my heart sank. They told me that both of the fuse boxes in my car were blown, and all the fuses had to be replaced. They couldn't find any other electrical issues with the car, and I knew deep down that something from that house had caused it, though I kept that to myself. I've always had a sensitivity to these kinds of things. I can walk into a house and feel if it's haunted or not, and I can also sense people's emotions. A few months later, a friend sent me a photo of the house, showing two small shadows in one of the side windows. We believed they were the spirits of children. He also reminded me of a black box two of the guys had found and burned. They wouldn't let anyone else see it. He told me it was filled with disturbing images related to children, which is why they destroyed it. We suspect the previous owner of the house may have been involved in some horrible activities. Here are some photos of the house. The second one is zoomed in on the back window, or maybe it's one of the side windows. I've had people check the last photo, which was taken right before I got the message to get out, and they said they could sense something evil in it. I've also noticed a larger figure in that second photo, the same figure I saw in the front left window of the house, watching me.
This happened when I was a kid. Our house was surrounded by woods, with only a few neighbors nearby. Occasionally, late at night around midnight, I'd be lying in bed unable to sleep, and I'd get this eerie feeling like something or someone was watching me. Sometimes, I'd hear footsteps coming from the attic right above my bedroom, as if someone was walking around up there. One night, after hearing the footsteps again, I got out of bed and went into the hallway. Everyone in my family was asleep, and their doors were closed, so I went back to my room and shut the door. As I lay there, the footsteps continued, and then I heard something fall inside my closet. Terrified, I ran to my parents' bedroom and woke them up. At first, they were confused, but after I explained what I heard, they told me it was probably just my imagination and didn't seem too worried. They walked with me back to my bedroom to check things out. When they looked in the closet, they found that a board game had spilled all over the floor. It had been on a shelf at the back of the closet, so there was no way it could have fallen on its own without someone or something pushing it off. My parents helped me clean it up and put everything back in place. They reassured me that there was nothing to be afraid of and then tucked me back into bed before going back to their room. A few minutes after they left, I heard someone whispering my name. Then, I saw a shadow that looked like a person moving across the wall near my closet. Convinced it was a ghost, I panicked, grabbed my pillow and blanket, and went to sleep on the floor in my parents' bedroom. I ended up sleeping on their floor for a few more nights after that. Eventually, I went back to sleeping in my own room, but the footsteps in the attic continued every now and then around midnight until we finally moved away. To this day, I still don't know what or who was behind those noises, but it still creeps me out.
In the spring of 1953, when I was 9 years old, I witnessed my brother's tragic death. I'll never forget that day. The memory has stayed with me, haunting me ever since. Part of it is the trauma, the slow, creeping realization that he was gone, forever changing my life. But there's more to it, something I've kept to myself for years, and I feel the need to share it now. It was the 10th of April. School had just let out, and my brother, Tommy, and I were walking home like we always did. Those were good times. Our mom always had snacks waiting for us, usually cookies and milk. Tommy had a smile that could light up a room. He was a year older than me, bursting with energy, and we would often play superheroes together. Tommy was always Captain Patriot, and I was his sidekick. With his wild ginger hair, freckles, and sparkling green eyes, he might not have looked like a superhero, but he certainly played the part well. After our snack, he'd grab a garbage can lid to use as his shield, and I'd pick up my toy gun, and we'd head out to fight imaginary villains on the front lawn. That day, we were eager to play when we got home. Tommy was ahead of me, calling back, "Come on, Joey, Mom's waiting." I remember the smile on his face so clearly. I also remember seeing that green 1953 Chevrolet Bel Air turn the corner behind him, speeding down the road. First, I didn't think much of it. Why would I? The car should have just passed by without any problem, even if it was going a bit too fast. But then, Tommy turned to look at the car, maybe admiring it like we always did, since we thought those cars were the coolest. When I heard the bang of the tire, I didn't understand what it was at first. The cloud of debris that followed caught my attention, and that's when I realized the car was veering toward us. I caught a glimpse of the driver's face, frozen in panic as he tried to regain control. Tommy didn't have time to react. The car jumped the curb, hitting him head-on. He was thrown back like a rag doll as the car careened over the sidewalk and down into the shallow ditch beside us, pinning him beneath it. I felt nothing but the wind as the car sailed past me and heard nothing but the screech of metal. I threw down my backpack and ran toward the wreckage. Tommy was still conscious, his face twisted in agony. The car was crushing his lower body, and his screams of pain echoed in my ears. Those screams haunt me to this day. I was too shocked to speak. His cries were heart-wrenching. I glanced inside the car and saw the windshield was cracked and bloodied. The driver wasn't going to be of any help. Joey." Tommy's voice was weak and desperate. "Help? Please." Tears streamed down his face. I didn't want to leave him, but I knew I had to get help. I ran back to the road, looking for a passing car, anyone who could assist us. Just moments earlier, the street had been bustling with cars, but now it was eerily silent. The world seemed dimmer, as if a thick fog had rolled in, muting the sunlight. The only sound was Tommy's fading whimpers. Desperately, I looked around and spotted a figure in the fog. I waved and shouted for help. "Hey, mister, we need help, please." The figure in the distance didn't hurry. I called out again, waving my arms frantically. "Sir, please, come quickly. We need help." I glanced back at Tommy. He was so pale. His hands were gripping the car's grill. Then, from behind me, I heard a high-pitched voice. "Well, isn't this quite the predicament?" I jumped and turned to see the man from the distance. But how had he gotten there so fast? Had he run when I wasn't looking? He was dressed entirely in black. A heavy coat, a fedora, and leather gloves. He looked like a businessman on his way home from work. "Sir," I said, my voice trembling, "please, we need to call someone. A hospital, something." The man chuckled. A light, carefree sound that filled me with anger. How could he laugh at a time like this? "My dear boy, a hospital won't save your brother now. Oh no, he's too injured for that," the man said. "What do you mean?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "Your brother is going to die, I'm afraid," the man replied. "But that's why I'm here." He extended a gloved hand toward me. I just stared at it, unable to move. When I didn't respond, he patted my shoulder and walked past me, moving down the ditch toward Tommy. He approached him casually, as if Tommy's cries meant nothing to him. I was too stunned to react, trying to process what he had said. Was this man serious? Was he insane? The man knelt beside Tommy, his smile calm and soothing. "Don't worry, dear boy," he said, gently brushing Tommy's forehead. Instantly, Tommy's cries ceased. His body relaxed, and he let out a sigh. There, let's get you out of this awful place." The man grabbed Tommy by the arms and pulled him out from under the car in one swift motion. I opened my mouth to protest, but before I could say anything, Tommy was standing like nothing had happened. I called out to him, reaching out for a hug, but the man stepped between us, blocking my way. "I can't allow that," he said, his tone firm. "I'm sorry. Why not?" I pleaded, and the man's expression grew serious. "Because he's no longer part of your world," the man explained. "You weren't supposed to see this. My work isn't meant for prying eyes, but sometimes these things happen. There's a purpose in everything, though I can't allow you to touch him." Tommy didn't look at me. His eyes had a distant, lifeless quality. The man turned back to the car and opened the door. He pulled the driver from his seat. A teenager with a broken neck, his head bent at an impossible angle. The sight horrified me. The driver should have been dead. But the man showed no concern for the driver's condition. He placed his hands on the driver's cheeks and with a sharp movement, snapped his head back into place with a sickening crack. "All better," he said sweetly, then looked at me. "What happens to me?" I asked. He had said Tommy was going to die, and the driver was clearly dead too. So if I could see them, did that mean I was also dead? Was this man going to hurt me for witnessing this? "Oh, I'm not going to hurt you. And you're very much alive, Joey," the man said, offering a warm smile. I hadn't spoken those thoughts aloud. How did he know what I was thinking? I was too stunned to respond. "Very few people see me," he continued. "Most don't want to, and that's understandable." What do you do?" I asked, my voice shaking. It was just one of the many questions racing through my mind. "I'm something of a chauffeur," he explained. "I pick people up and drop them off. One day, I'll be picking you up too." "How do you know my name?" I stammered. He didn't answer. Instead, he smiled and took the hands of both Tommy and the teenage driver. "Don't worry about it. That day won't come for a while. For now, I must go. I'm a busy man, you know." With that, he led Tommy and the driver back up to the road. A black car was waiting there, one I hadn't noticed before. Later, I'd recognize it as a 1935 Duesenberg convertible. The man helped Tommy and the driver into the back seat, then climbed behind the wheel. He gave me a friendly wave before driving off. And that was it. I collapsed onto the grass, my back against the car, and started to cry. When I looked back at where Tommy had been, I was shocked to see him still lying there, pinned beneath the vehicle, his lifeless eyes staring up at the sky. I was still in the ditch when the police arrived. I watched them take Tommy away. They also removed the driver, and his neck was still broken, just as it had been before. But this time, no one tried to fix it. The injury had been fatal, just as I had originally thought. I didn't fully understand what I had witnessed until much later. Even now, I'm not entirely sure. Every now and then, when I'm driving and see a car accident, I'll spot a black Duesenberg convertible parked nearby. I don't think anyone else sees it. Once, I saw that same man, and I could swear he looked at me and winked. I've come to call him Mr. Phantom. It seems like the only name that fits. Sometimes, I'll see his car driving by on the street. I assume he's on his way to other business. People are always passing away, after all. I learned a lot about the world that day, more than most people ever know. I learned about the ways of death. But every day when I wake up, I'm grateful not to see him standing over my bed, hand extended and that carefree smile on his face. I know that day will come eventually, and I just hope I'm ready when it does. Hi, I'm Sarah, 12F, and I live with my brother Jake, 13M, my little sister Emma, 2F, and my mom, Lily, 36F, in a house in Ohio. My mom loves going thrift shopping and often brings back interesting items to sell. One day, she returned with some cool records and old photographs. The pictures showed a large family, but I didn't think much of it. The records looked normal, so I didn't pay much attention. One evening, my mom, Jake, Emma, our babysitter, and I were all sitting in the living room, just hanging out and chatting. Everything was calm until, out of nowhere, I heard a little girl's voice say, "Where's Daddy?" I quickly looked around the room but didn't see anyone. I glanced back at my mom and Jake, wondering if they had heard it too. They looked at me, confused, and asked what was wrong. I told them I had just heard a little girl's voice in my ear asking, "Where's Daddy?" My mom's face went pale. She then explained that she had heard the exact same thing the day before and was so freaked out that she ran downstairs, thinking someone was in her room. I couldn't believe it. How could we both hear the same thing? The next day, I was still a bit uneasy but tried to put it out of my mind. That weekend, Jake and I went to stay with our dad, leaving Mom and Emma at home. Soon after, I got a call from my mom, and she sounded really scared. I asked what had happened, and she told me that she had left some things on her desk. She stepped out of her room for just a moment, and suddenly, she heard a loud crash. She ran back to her room, thinking Emma had knocked something over or hurt herself, but Emma was fine. No cuts, no bruises, not even crying. I jokingly said, "What if there's a ghost in the house?" But my mom wasn't laughing. She said, "Maybe, have you seen those old photos? They're very dusty and old." The following week, we were in my mom's room, thinking about rearranging the furniture. My sister hadn't been sleeping well all week, but we didn't think too much of it. While we were in the room, my mom suddenly heard Emma crying, so we rushed to check on her. We asked her what was wrong, and she kept saying, "Baby, baby, baby," while pointing to the same corner where my mom and I had heard the little girl's voice. Since then, Emma has refused to sleep in her bed. She cries if she has to go near that corner. And even today, we're still living in that same house, wondering what exactly is going on. I'm 16 years old now, but I've moved 3 times already, and I still remember something from when I was 5 years old that has stayed with me. My mom used to put me to bed, turn off the light, and every time she left the room, I'd see a tall figure with a top hat. The worst part was the red eyes, those haunting red eyes. Every time I saw that figure, I'd scream as loud as I could, and my mom would rush in, finding me crying and pointing at the corner. She would roll her eyes, take me to her bed, and we'd end up watching movies together. Everything from Transformers to Nightmare on Elm Street. I didn't mind the scary movies. It was just that seeing that man in the corner terrified me to the point where my mom eventually let me sleep in her room all the time. A while later, my mom got kicked out of the house for smoking weed, but before she left, she gave me a Nintendo Wii. I still loved her, but it was strange because after she was gone, the man with the red eyes stopped appearing. But here's the unsettling part. I started seeing him in my dreams every Tuesday. I'd wake up screaming, and when my grandma got tired of the noise, I ended up sleeping with my grandpa instead. Fast forward to when I was 12 or maybe 13. My uncle and aunt had just moved in with my cousins, one of whom was a newborn at the time, so I couldn't sleep in my room because it was being used for the baby. The only time I was allowed in there was to grab my toys. I started sleeping either in the basement or upstairs on the floor with my grandpa. But that's when the nightmares started again. This time, it was a girl with huge fangs and black eyes. It would happen every 1 or 2 weeks, and I'd wake up terrified. To calm down, I'd stay up all night watching TV or playing video games on my grandpa's phone, Xbox 360 or PlayStation 4. This went on until I was 14 and finally got my own room again. But not even a day later, I had a new ghostly encounter. This time with a little boy who told me his parents were sorry for what they had done to me. I was confused until I looked up the history of my address and found out that a married couple with a young son had tragically died there. Not long after that, we moved out because my uncle decided to sell the house. The new place we moved into gave me a strange feeling from the start. It was old, with a rusty shed-out back and outdated rooms, but I didn't care much. I was in a phase where I didn't care about anything and stayed up late, often until 2 or 3 a.m., playing games like Call of Duty and Grand Theft Auto. But during those nights, I started hearing noises coming from above, and when the lights were off, I'd hear whispers telling me to harm myself. I didn't tell anyone because I knew I wasn't suicidal. I had people who cared about me, but as time went on, the nightmares got worse, filled with images of death and people screaming about how suicide was the only escape. One day, I decided to look up the history of the house, just like I had with the old one. I found out that a large family had once lived there, and they had all died by suicide. I was horrified and asked the owner about it since we were renting the place. She went pale and ignored my question, which left me shocked but also strangely indifferent. Now, this year we were kicked out again because the owner got tired of rising house payments and decided to sell. We moved in with my uncle, but weird things started happening there too. Things would go missing or move on their own. When I asked my aunt about it, she said they knew about it and had even named the ghost. Instead of being scared, I got curious, not so much about the history of the house, but about the ghost itself. I started trying to be friendly with the spirits. When I had dreams of ghosts that would usually scare people, I tried talking to them instead. Some didn't respond, some did, and some even used sign language. I think I've developed a connection to the dead, but at this point, I don't really mind.